Okie dokie. Hello again. We're continuing on with for the preparation for Wednesday office hours, and this is chapter 4, the Mizuoka uh, book on subsumption of space. This is chapter 4, and we left off somewhere around 4.3, I think. 4.4. If we can find it. Well, we seem to be doing a crappy job of finding it. All right, 4.4. So we were sort of fiddling around with discussion in 4.3. Uh, Weber's, not Max Weber, the other Weber. Uh, and let's just begin here at C. Remember, cheapening of cost price is, sort of under-attended to in the literature, and for a variety of reasons. But I think in this particular context, there is more relevance here because subsumption and agglomeration allow us to talk a little bit more about the relationship of this idea of cost price as a kind of boundary, as it were, between Department 1 and Department 2, which is kind of what it means. Anyway, C, the dialectics of agglomeration. I think we're all set to go. The direct elimination of pristine distance, or the agglomeration of industries, always accompanies its antagonistic counterpart, the need to subsume a larger extent of pristine space in real terms by means of transportation and communications. It's just, you're expanding in the environment or in the landscape even. So the need to subsume a larger extent of pristine space. If agglomeration would provide capital with a cheapening of individual value to the infinite degree, the process of agglomeration would continue forever. Ha! In this case, though, all the social demand on the uniform plane would be supplied from a single productive center at which all the labor processes in society are located. Now, this is just absurd, or it's too abstract, perhaps. This is, however, not the case in reality. As capital agglomerates at a spatial point, it creates adverse effects simultaneously. So you can imagine what that does, right? The idea, some kind of dynamic element is happening even as capital agglomerates at a point. And this doesn't necessarily, essentialize the point. It just merely shows how all these abstract things intersect. Agglomeration increases the distance from the productive center to the market. Now that's kind of the underlying thing in geography, which slows down the velocity of capital turnover and increases the amount of circulating capital necessary to maintain the continuity of production. So you're trading off something that's a little more physical, like distance, and dealing with a much more abstract thing called capital, and yet they're both involved. excessive congestion of various labor processes can be more detrimental than expeditious to the annihilation of time by space. So excessive congestion of various labor processes. At a certain level of agglomeration, it gives way to dispersal. The successful annihilation of space in one form inevitably increases the necessity to annihilate more space in another. So this is just a feature of, they're all sort of connected together, right? So if you do one thing, something else happens at the same time. There's sort of an interdependence. Capitalism has to negotiate this nice edge of the equilibrium in annihilating space. That's a whole thing we could get into. The capitalist optimum of scale of production and market area is nothing but the result of capitalism's having negotiated this nice edge of the equilibrium in annihilating space. For instance, the localization of the same sector at one spatial point, going back to the abstract, would inevitably bring about a larger market area in a longer period of circulation. In this case, the capitalist producing a commodity in the same sector might be better off locating in a dispersed fashion, reducing the amount of space it needs to subsume and realizing their product around their smaller market area in a shorter circulation period. So you can imagine what this means, right? It's better to not have everything in one big plant, but rather in a bunch of smaller plants, or without beating it up too much, the idea, for example, a dairy collective might have a cooperative might have this kind of arrangement. Anyway, among these labor processes, there is a relation of commodity exchange where space has been annihilated. There's a relation of commodity exchange. Through this type of agglomeration, capitalism again exploits the development of the productive forces of the social division of labor. In contrast, short distances generate a neighborhood effect. Okay, this is an interesting issue and does, in a slight way, I suppose, relate to center periphery issues. Anyway, at a regional level, and a certain social space can be established between entities located at short distances. This is the occurrence of place-based communities. Ortsverband. Now, place-based communities could be, in the modern sense, strip mall between two towns, moderately located to each other, and then you can get into a whole bunch of other instances, I think shelling, et cetera, on proximity and stuff, but we won't go there now. 4.4, spatial integration and network. A, spatial integration. As discussed earlier, space is annihilated, yet only virtually, through the construction and utilization of physical means such as transportation and communication, yet only virtually. Space is annihilated, yet only virtually. Society must integrate and materialize a large number of entities by means of transportation and communication into action spaces. Remember, we've talked about this before, right? This is termed, as Harvey would put it, David Harvey, I assume this is Limits of Capital, spatial integration. Another process of real subsumption of relative space. Okay? Spatial integration is another process of real subsumption of relative space. With spatial integration, territories produced by the real subsumption of absolute space become more realistic. So this is a kind of, intermediate kind of location, or looking at, space not in the big picture, but in more locally organized areas. Now, since spatial integration does not annihilate space physically, in other words, the space is not changed, but it does by time. while the distance and location elements of physical space remain intact. In other words, everything is where it is, but spatial annihilation occurs with your ability to traverse an area, etc. All right. For the agencies of market transactions and members of social groups to act mutually in dispersed locations, resources and labor must be allocated to the production of transportation and communication to overcome distance. Resources and labor is part of this process, right? In order to enact market transactions and for members of social groups to interact. By overcoming isolation in this way, the isolated entities can interact with each other more efficiently in a shorter time, even with the same physical distance. Unlike bounding, remember we talked about bounding before, right? We're looking at kind of layers of these kinds of divisions or circumscriptions, whatever. Unlike bounding, which is substantiated through the coercive power of the state apparatus, spatial integration involves the production of massive physical transport or communication lines and their subsequent maintenance, mainly by the state power. This gets into public stuff. So for relative space, the production of the quote unquote iron frame is accomplished. This is a reference, iron frame, I think, to Weber, the other one, Max. Maybe not, but anyway, is accomplished with heavy public investment or private investment approved by the authority. Although the real subsumption of absolute space also needs such physical installations as demarcation stones, walls, or passport control posts, the subsumption of relative space takes far heavier physical investment on the real environment. Now, this was a reason behind the disappearance of the great territories of the empire established by conquest. So if spatial integration is not achieved, then the action space of the social group cannot be substantially formed, given the strong distance decay effect. This is a problem, in the American sense about westward expansion. It's kind of hard to control, and you've got your, it's dances with wolves, right? You have, remote sites that are not fully or poorly spatially integrated. The inside of the territory is difficult to homogenize, and the entity in the territory cannot be consolidated. Therefore, the market and society face the failure to unify, and society would be on the verge of collapse. You could argue that. In fact, even in the case of Western expansion, fortunately, some tech allows that to stay viable. There aren't that many instances of indigenous tribes knocking down telegraph poles, but there are. So that's sort of a way you could talk about that. And they're doing it for, with all due respect, rational reasons. But anyway, relative space formally subsumed ultimately leads to the negation of society itself. Section B, integrating the two-dimensional plane with one-dimensional lines. Now, the interesting question is, if you want to get into the technical aspects of it, a one-dimensional line is on a two-dimensional plane, is it not? Or can be on it. Well, okay. Well, let's not go there. A flow is only effective to the extent that it enters into a relationship with others, because pristine space is a plane with a two-dimensional width. Mere assemblage of separate flows is not sufficient to establish relationships, unless you live in flatland. The connection of a mere 2 points by means of transportation and communication is insufficient. To integrate the area realistically and make it into a real action space, with the exception of wireless communications, a network has to be created. Well, the network is created even regardless of the exception of wireless communications. You're just distinguishing between wireline and wireless, but needless to say, both are networks. And in fact, actual networks are combinations of wireline and wireless, microwave towers, antennas, etc. Lefebvre did not forget to list junction points as an element of the spatial mosaic. Without it, the social groups in the produced space cannot engage in the social interactions which support the consolidation of society. These junction points are a form of agglomeration. The junction points are a form of agglomeration, which are mostly prepared and managed by those with state or economic power. However, oppressed people may create and manage some other points in secrecy. Okay, westward expansion, 19th century, smoke signals as opposed to the telegraph, right? That's an interesting mythical idea, amplified by motion pictures. But, that the whole issue of signs over space, the idea of, in the European context, semaphores or whatever, are interesting other versions of the same thing. In fact, probably more reliable than signal fires. But anyway, in the network, you could argue that the network could be different as well. You could do it by, this is the colonial argument about the jungle drums, right? Anyway, in the network, multiple one-dimensional segments are intertwined like a web, creating a fictitious one-point world, despite the area being a two-dimensional plane. So this is interesting, this idea that it is like a spider web in that context, where it's kind of flimsy on the one hand, and appears to be a one-point world, particularly those who aren't yet trapped in the spider web. But anyway, thus, the means of transportation and communication must be produced as a web-like configuration or a network. This is the issue that we might bring up with Jason Moore on the web of life, whatever. Now, historically, networks were created in medieval Europe as a space of exchange and communications, right? We've talked about this before, right? Market, the location of market roads, market towns, some over others, and growth and blah 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 blah. And under the feudal mode of production, a network of overland routes, those of traders, pilgrims, and crusaders, as well as, quote, hydraulic ports and seaboard cities and inland water transport. So this relates to the question raised in reference, to other kinds of societies and, Asiatic despotism, whatever, hydraulic societies, right, that are defined in some ways by, waterways, etc. The cities emerged out of the nodal points of the network, or a unified entity and as a subject. So this is an interesting transformation because it is clearly dynamic. And the fact that it is, quote unquote, a subject raises some other interesting questions. Now, towards the end of the Middle Ages, the royal power made up towns and urban systems, or the secularized urban network. Now, royal power, in other words, supersedes, for a variety of political and ideological and military reasons, political reasons, the network of churches in the European context, Catholic churches, become superseded by royal entities. And it's not that these royal entities weren't there all in the first place, but they begin to displace, as it were, the dominance of religious, nodes. In the contemporary urban space, a city, the nodal point of the network ensures that links are properly maintained between various flows involved. That is, flows of energy and labor, of commodities and capital. Now, that's in reference to Lefebvre, but note that people like Manuel Castells, are following in the same tradition. So this is not just one, line of inquiry, but it's kind of widely configured. Anyway, subsection C, spatial dialectics of the network. Now, the main dialectics of the network are embedded in its geometry. One-dimensional segments need to be used to integrate a two-dimensional territory. Each position on the plane has an unequal distance between transport lines or agglomeration points. The distance decay effect in a network is therefore not proportional to physical distance. The isotropic property of absolute space is thereby negated. So, in one sense, you could say that our more mathematical conceptual construction of the space is always problematized by its irregularity. And therefore, agglomeration points do not appear like a Cartesian grid. That may be the argument there, but we can talk about that. A denser network or more rapid means of transport might seem to be a solution in transcending this dialectic towards the perfect space integration. You can't even assume a perfect space integration. I mean, it may exist in your mind, and it may certainly be projected in applying iron grids on cities, right, on city planning layouts or whatever, the street system, the utility provisions, and all that sort of stuff. But a denser network or more rapid means of transport might seem to be a solution in transcending this dialectic towards the perfect space integration. However, these approaches confront the network with another round of dialectics. And I think it's important to consider that when Marx is, talking about circuits of capital, for example, these are rounds. These are also dialectical rounds when you consider how they operate, how they move, what is the fundamental point. And particularly this, one needs to recall that because we're talking about subsumption, we're talking about certain kinds of construction or constructing. Anyway, first, consider the possibility of making the network infinitely dense. As the density of networks increases, there will certainly be economies of scope at first. Note that, let me break here for a second. There is the idea of scope and scale not widely considered, which is, problematic, but on the other hand, probably a good thing to do certain stuff. There will certainly be economies of scope at first, and the individual lines of the network will be more efficiently utilized. Compare the efficiency of the facility between a local ski area with only one lift and a run, and the large ski resort with a network of many lifts and runs. So that's the difference between skiing in Connecticut and skiing in Vermont, I suppose. However, as the network becomes denser, the individual lines that make up the network become more redundant. The traffic demand for each section, a line segment constituting the network, decreases, and the management of each network component becomes less profitable because there's, choosing going on, I suppose. The extent of the economies of scope is determined at the point where the marginal increase in revenue due to user growth resulting from denser networks comes at par with a marginal increase in cost due to the construction of an additional line. And in fact, you could see, well, anyway. Now, denser traffic networks also face physical challenges. A dense network requires more space for rights of way for transportation and communication. A dense network requires more space for rights of way, right? Remember, we talked about this before, that the rights of way have a certain kind of, because in fact that they're legal, is that they intervene in a kind of interesting way. The higher the density of the action space, the smaller the space to be allocated for the real function is another paradox. The smaller the space to be allocated for the real function becomes, the smaller the space to be allocated for real function becomes, that's the problematic construction, is another paradox in network construction, which becomes an acute problem of a limit to high-rise buildings because the space of the lift hall increases as the building becomes taller. The space of the lift hall. So, and from a modern point of view, this is, of course, the issue, right? How many elevators do you need for certain types of structures? Or the obverse is, can we create structures? And this is applied in more residential structures as opposed to commercial. Lift of the space hall is important in the sense that usually most building occurs around it from a utilities point of view. But there is this issue of, the fetish for tall buildings, et cetera. And we can use that example. What is it? 84 Park, whatever it is in New York, the one that has, is very tall but very thin. Anyway, due to these, and of course there are other issues, as we've now discovered with that one structure about the aerodynamics of the structure. But anyway, due to these paradoxes, the sociospatial process of spatial integration cannot fully recover the perfectly uniform isotropic planes as in the original absolute space. So, this is a problematic contradiction, is that, planners or urban designers impose a sense of absolute space, and no differently than urban design or urban city planning occurred in colonial periods, when you get, and particularly in port cities, for example, you have, at least in new port cities, as opposed to older port cities, about the imposition of the grid. Anyway, like in, for example, Singapore. A spatially integrated territory is thus not perfectly homogenized. The locational advantage is greater when a point is connected by multiple transport lines. In this case, nodes or junctions of the transportation lines may be created, and these nodes provide a particular potential advantage for the new location of the labor processes. Every node of a transportation route does not always experience the agglomeration of economic function. Then you can see that in for example, if you were designing a history of, or if you were evaluating the history of the London Underground, some of those were not optimal, and the city changed, and it raises interesting questions about the revitalization or the imposition of new subway lines, underground lines. I mean, some are efficient, right? The Circle Line, for example, is kind of optimal in the sense that it never, reverses. It always is moving around, circling. Anyway, these nodes can offer a favorable locational condition. The node becomes a quote-unquote locus of action, which will grow into a point of agglomeration around which the social and economic activities are organized. This, it replaces the notion of totality, which we would associate with the absolute, space. and develops into a spatial center and decentering of society. This is Lefebvre talking about why I suppose this is the way he talks about the center and periphery of Paris and his discussion on Les Halles. But I don't know. We'll suppose we could talk about that. Subsection D, the two types of networks and power. Now, the network has two types. There's a nodal network and a homogeneous network, and they're closely related to the class nature of the network. The power and class are clearly etched into the spatial configuration of a network, power and class. The pattern of the network is planned and produced, to facilitate power, domination, capital accumulation, or military deployment, right? Paris and Louis, Bonaparte III, Napoleon III, etc. The resulting configuration is a typical representation of space, représentation de l'espace, where the vertical power structures are clearly embedded and the subordinated people must follow. So with all due respect, the whole Haussmann conversion of Paris into more efficient hub-spoke nodes and blah, 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 and demolition, etc., is also not simply an act of building or demolition, and of course to facilitate military capability, but it's also, a thing about capital and, the credit mobilier, etc. There's problematic elements in terms of debt credit, in terms of doing that kind of stuff. And yes, that occurs even in today. The dominant power prefers a nodal pattern, centering its power at the node of the highest order. Now, to facilitate domination, the power creates a hierarchical nodal system of space consisting of the highest order core, secondary nodal points, and so on, and a more marginalized periphery. So let me stop there and say, this is kind of how, the CBD, or the central business district, is that kind of model, right? The central business district is not necessarily identical to government or governance, but it kind of, the proximity is interesting, and even more interesting in other contexts. But anyway, these hierarchical points of agglomeration are connected by transportation and communication network built through public investment by the political power. The nationwide spines of railways and highways, with the center of administration occupying the most important agglomeration point of the network, reinforce the nodal space. So you have a nodal space, but you have also a network, and you have within it these agglomeration points, which are not necessarily, evenly dispersed. In colonies, back to the text, in colonies, the network is configured in the interest of the colonial power, typically to connect the peripheral areas with a major port that connects the suzerain. It was by no means built into the interests of the indigenous peoples, clearly not. Although you can argue it in certain ways, historically, but, I suppose Japanese port development might have that feature. I don't know. It was by no means built in the interests of the indigenous people. The indigenous people would need a more homogeneous network rather than a hierarchical network, I suppose, for their spatial mobility and communication to the benefit of everyone. Yet it was largely neglected. So you can see the division between a formal structure and an informal structure in that context. Back to the text, the spatial mobility of people is thus canalized into the hierarchical configuration where the suzerain power dominates. The growth of an urban system also tends to follow this spatial spine, which indigenous or traditional urban systems are forced to follow. Section E, Increased velocity aggravates spatial unevenness. So you have spatial unevenness and, the dynamism increases. Let's put it that way. There is an inherent paradox of spatial integration in networks consisting of lines and nodes. This paradox manifests itself more clearly as more efficient means of transportation traveling at higher speed or carrying larger volumes are put into use. Faster means of transportation cost more per kilometer to build and operate. Therefore, such networks become invariably sparser than the conventional ones, aggravating spatial unevenness and generating a spatial configuration with a hub and spoke structure. Now, you can actually see this operative, right, in a variety of types of network, and you don't have to see it necessarily within an urban context, right? You could say, and I'm not going to fully argue this, but, it is why there was an evolution of hub-spoke, path design in airline routes. And I'm not going to over-argue that, but it's kind of an interesting way in which you can compare the two. And it is dissimilar in that sense, the airline network relative to path dependency to network design, simply because the flows are different. They're more complicated. They have all kinds of other contingencies. Therefore, back to the text. Therefore, in the market economy, it's not economically feasible to construct a dense and homogeneous network of transport lines capable of operating vehicles at such high speed. Now, this is clear when considering the difference in the density of the network between the conventional and high-speed rails, or the difference in the density of the network between a conventional road and motorway. Therefore, the high-speed transportation system indispensable for supporting the globalization. You see, we're already moved to some other kind of scope here, scale, is bound to be organized in a sparser network, and more places are separated from the wayside. Now, this is how you kind of argue in a train network, the difference between locals and express trains, or local trains, express trains, and regional transit, or high-speed, intercity rail, or whatever. Anyway, additionally, even for a place along the line, isolation increases in the areas which do not have high-speed rail stations or motorway interchanges. In this way, the spatial unevenness aggravates and pristine distance revives its power as transportation speeds increase. Now, the simple example of this is, getting off of toll roads or interstate highway turnpike systems. They're normally you could, you think, well, there should be more off ramps, but there aren't. They do that because they want your money. And it does restrict, it creates more spatial unevenness anyway. In Japan, after the opening of the Shinkansen, that is, the bullet train, although it certainly became faster and easier to meet Morioka, a major city in Tohoku, that is northeastern Honshu, from Tokyo along the direct Shinkansen line, the city of Akita on the Sea of Japan, once served by a direct conventional train service from Tokyo, can now only be reached via Morioka. And for Yasu Wakamatsu, an inland city on a branch line that also had direct service, the passengers now need to transfer from the Shinkansen to conventional lines at an intermediate station. This is, problematic. It's the difference between getting from London to Oxford, with only one stop in Reading, as opposed to accidentally getting on a train that stopped at every damn station between, London and Oxford. Anyway, a large disparity in transportation services began to arise among cities in the Tohoku region, which had been essentially equal until the advent of the Shinkansen. Similarly, there are just some cities that just aren't served by, high-speed express trains, and they shouldn't. I mean, in terms of when you think about it from a demographic point of view, um, if you assume that the major nodes will have great bigger demographic, populations, there is, there is a kind of hierarchy of use in that sense. All right. Furthermore, back to the text. Furthermore, pressure from a political guru tends to influence the decision on the routes and stations of high-speed transportation. Even an international travel guidebook of The Lonely Planet of 1991 states, quote, the Joetsu, the Shinkansen line, is frequently held up as a prime example of Japanese political corruption. Niigata, a city on the Sea of Japan coast with a population of 0.8 million, is not really of sufficient importance to require a Shinkansen railway line, so passenger usage has been relatively low. To make matters worse, the route had to tunnel straight through the mountainous spine of Honshu, which made it a very expensive project. So why did it get built? Well, because Niigata was the hometown of Prime Minister Kakue Tanaka, whose political activities also included taking a couple million US dollars in bribe money from Lockheed Aircraft, close quote. So I think you can see this operative in many other instances. You can see it problematized in less corrupt ways. It always seems counterintuitive to ride the American Amtrak system and ultimately have to switch to a bus to get where you need to go. I mean, it raises just some interesting questions because, in fact, in the history of rail lines, a lot of some of those rail right of ways still exist, and if you really wanted to do it properly, but I think you can't economically justify it. You could put light rail in and make it more continuous as opposed. Well, anyway, back to the text. Generally, the neoliberalist deregulation policies freed the operators of public transportation from maintaining a more homogeneous network of transportation services overall, and including the sectors in underpopulated areas that were kept running through internal subsidies. So there's cross subsidies that go on. This is the whole question of whether, and the example would be universal service in electricity, for example, or telephones, landlines, because of the design of the system. You need to have the density or the pricing support. It's just not economically feasible to lay in line way out to wireless has changed that, but some things are just more expensive in the rural areas, and of course they're more isolated because people prefer it that way or because it's economically driven. But there's a cross subsidy that is the cities support the country in that sense. They have a cross subsidy, and that's what you need regulation for, because the market is not going to do it. Anyway, these operators resorted to concentrating on services in densely populated areas where demand is higher and more profit is expected. They thus switched to a strategy of, this is a problematic term. Let me just stop here. Cream skimming, which is necessary for maintaining the profitability of their business, but does not entertain the money-losing sectors. So, and I think you should describe this further, put in a footnote or something, because cream skimming is, it doesn't work real well in a kind of materialist or Marxist or radical political economy sense. Cream skimming is surplus value. Is it not, right? Well, maybe it isn't. Thus, the configuration of national space becomes increasingly uneven along with the development of higher velocity means of transportation. The distance decay effect does not completely disappear despite the speeding up of the means of transportation, but it even enhances the barrier of pristine distance in the sparser transportation network. In sum, the increasing velocity and volume of transportation aiming at further efficiency in annihilation of space makes spatial configuration more uneven. So that's the paradox, right? Even if the transport lines that form the axes of the national land is maintained, it does not guarantee a homogeneous national space. To maintain efficiency, the spatial configuration invariably shifts to more nodal structure, constituting of core and peripheral, that is, surrounding areas. So this is why it coheres in our histories. Subsection F, emergence of hub and spoke space under neoliberalism. So now that air and marine container transportation have become the global standard for a variety, and it's a really interesting history of the invention of what is it called, intermodal, whatever. The spatial configuration has increasingly become more nodal, right? Nodal as opposed to modal, right? Major airline companies established a hub and spoke configuration in which large international airports are set as a base called hubs, where trunk lines between hubs are efficiently connected by large aircraft, and branch lines connecting hubs to small cities around hubs are connected by small ones. In Southeast and East Asia, only a few airports, such as Singapore, Incheon in Seoul, Bangkok, and Hong Kong, function as hubs. In marine container transportation, physical distribution occurs from the hub ports of Hong Kong, Singapore, and Busan in Korea. Cargo is transported by small vessels or lorries, trucks, to these large container terminals, which transship to large mainline marine container ships and transported to Europe and North America. Hub and spoke spatial structure is a neoliberalist product of the pursuit of efficient spatial integration that seeks economies of scale on trunk lines, subsidiary lines, by consolidating traffic flows into few larger traffic arteries, and uses smaller and cost-effective transportation to meet demand in peripheral areas along branch lines. And you can see how, this is a path problem or a capacity problem or a profit problem in terms of how you allocate those things. And you see, often things that don't serve the consumer very well by overbooking planes and trying to, because it's an opportunity cost problem, blah, blah, blah. Back to the text. Under neoliberalism, the principle of remember I mentioned cross-subsidy that supported the homogeneity of spatial configuration has been criticized and scrapped. You want to ask the question of why cross-subsidy does get criticized and scrapped. I think it is a cost-price problem. I would assert that it's a cost-price problem. I don't know the literature, but we should look at that. The production of homogeneous spatial configuration networks through channels of public finance and cross-subsidy has been reduced due to national and local fiscal crises. National and local, this is the question of what counts as regional also. Anyway, hence, it is impossible to run a loss-generating sector in the transportation network. Now, that's an assumption of, a more perfect competition, which I don't know if you really want to argue that, but, particularly if you're going to argue this assumption thing. But anyway, we'll get back to it. New low-cost air carriers, LCC, enter only in the sectors where high passenger demand is expected. In this cream skimming strategy, it I wish you would use another term, the surplus building strategy. Some fare reduction is made in the trunk line section, but in the spoke sectors, the service thins out in exchange for enhanced monopoly, where the users are forced to patronize inferior services at higher fares. There's just some places you should be able to afford to go to these places, or you can't go to these places. And probably the more extreme version, of course, is Alaska, perhaps, because there are constraints. There's no roads and blah, blah, blah. In recent years, the pursuit of profit under the principle of self-support deteriorated public transport in rural areas where cream skimming operators are not attracted to invest and operate. Now, this, presumes a lack of regional and state level governments. But anyway, thus, these sectors can be managed as a form of social capital by public-private partnerships. Well, yes and no, and we won't argue that here. However, as neoliberalism dominates even in the public sector, demanding the social capital be managed under the market principle, the service of unprofitable sectors in the rural district was forcefully abandoned. The public transport system itself is disappearing from rural areas, with residents left to personal automobiles and the traffic right of the people who cannot drive or own a car. That is, the right to the action space is deprived, while urban agglomerations with transit hubs or trunk terminals in which economies of scale operate have a competitive advantage in the potential for further growth. This leads to more intense intercity competition to attract hubs to its own city. Only the greater metropolis, only the quote-unquote greater metropolis that wins this competition will be eligible to claim the title of quote-unquote world city in the global neoliberal competition. Thus, the spatial configuration under neoliberalism greatly changed from the dense, homogeneous space network attained through cost subsidy to a hub-spoke nodal space, with the agglomeration of metropolitan areas as the core and traffic flow concentrated, while rural areas are deserted. Thus, the process of the annihilation of space under neoliberalism creates a more uneven landscape. Subsection G, the paradox of the network and internet. The internet seems to have transcended this contradiction of spatial integration for communication. No matter where the user is, information flows around globally at the click of a mouse. The internet, which combines maximum speed and network density, seems to have perfected spatial integration, making global convergence a reality. Infinitely perfect spatial integration is a situation in which any quality and quantity of interaction is carried out anywhere, regardless of time and location, with transportation and communication costs being kept minimal, regardless of the distance. On the internet, since the spatial conditions on the access to the information are supposedly ubiquitous, there seems hardly be any need for agglomeration, creating the situation where location is mobile, as in Alfred Weber's industrial location theory. That's worth looking at further, and kind of interesting relative to when it was produced in terms of the dispersal of modernist networks, etc. In the background of the virtual homogeneity of the internet, however, there is a physical network of optical fiber which is highly nodal. This extreme contrast between the virtual and the real is a significant contrast to the spatial configuration of the internet. And, it's not easily contrasted when you consider with particularly optical fiber optic networks and stuff and other server maps and stuff. It's kind of an interesting problem because it's much more integrated relative, as I would assert, relative to, for example, the rise in satellite stuff. But anyway, back to the text. While the homogeneity and temporal immediacy of the organization of cyberspace, homogeneity, temporal immediacy, give the internet an almost complete physical form of the annihilation of space by time, the fiber optic and other networks through which actual information flows form highly nodal spaces centered in the United States and with a few large cities around the world as secondary hubs. Now, I think you can see that even in historical context with the nature of, for example, telegraph networks. Drawing upon Lefebvre's example, computer science can dominate space in such a fashion that a computer can assemble an immediate mass of information relating to a given physical or social space and process it at a single location. Information on the internet is transmitted by dividing it into small packets, quote unquote. Data indicating the destination of information is attached to each packet, and many information packets flow simultaneously on the same line like cars on a road. Unlike a telephone phone call, where a pair of users occupy one line exclusively, imagine the history of the party line. Anyway, the line does not become engaged. However, if a large amount of packets flow through the small bandwidth simultaneously, traffic congestion occurs, just like when many cars rush onto a narrow road, making information transfer slower. It is the time where the user who goes to the personal computer is irritated and realizes the materiality of cyberspace. This is, let's see, what's an example of that? You could say that rural public libraries, you would assume that it has much more high-speed broadband. They don't, or it's throttled different ways, or divided different ways, or is co-opted by other electronic or electrical things in the region, which is kind of interesting to me in the sense that you're looking at a complex set of overlaid networks, that is the network of microwave transmitters, antennas, cell phone antennas, satellite communication, the overlaid the electrical network, the utility network, and the position of electrical power as being, on the one hand, even, on the other hand, not so even at all relative to the location of substations, et cetera. And I know that sounds incredibly complicated and probably can be worked out in a smaller regional, urban, or exurban. I mean, probably the exurban would be most interesting because it is a combination of the rural and the or it is an example of the intersection of rural and urban, as well as the problematic elements of sprawl. In defining what counts as exurban, that's a whole nother set of things. And if you did it from a utility point of view, that is electrical, electronic, broadcast, cable line or wire line, all of these things built together, I think are interesting problems. In other words, well, anyway, the irritated and the materiality of cyberspace. Conversely, to obtain customer satisfaction and overcome competition in the e-commerce industry, that may be anachronistic as well. But anyway, servers must be installed in the nodal cities where lines with sufficiently large bandwidth converge so that packet congestion does not occur on the servers hosting e-commerce programs and data. The agglomeration of the e-commerce businesses in these hub cities is also necessary to arrange a system where huge amounts of goods are stocked and dispatched quickly to the consumer. So, with respect, you see this is the problem of an overlapping and interrelated problem of, location of, and in fact, it's interesting from a monopoly point of view, I suppose, with Amazon Web Services and Amazon, the delivery service or retailer. Anyway, the demand space of e-commerce is expanding globally, supported by the immediacy and homogeneity of cyberspace. This is an argument that has existed for decades without, any real decent, I think, research. But anyway, therefore, the spatial configuration of e-commerce creates the contrasting landscape of strong nodes consisting of extreme business agglomeration versus vast and flat design space. Demand space, I'm sorry. Therefore, the spatial configuration of e-commerce creates the contrasting landscape of strong nodes consisting of extreme business agglomeration versus a vast and flat demand space. So, prairie states might be an example of that, where you have servers being placed, server farms or whatever, server cities being created that on the one hand are cities. I mean, they have labor, not as much because of, AI, blah, blah, blah. But they do serve in these kinds of ways. And, and you're thinking, well, why is it in this vast and flat demand space are you seeing, supply being created or agglomerations or nodes being created? And how uneven is that relative to the demands, as we currently are confronted with, the power and water requirements of these servers? So I think that's a reasonable area to look at. This gives cities with internet hubs the potential for agglomeration through strong clustering of e-commerce business to win the competition between cities and to attain the status of a world city. It is desirable to lay high bandwidth internet cables at the center of the city in a nodal manner, together with large airports and maritime container terminals. The city successful in winning will have a competitive advantage as a global node. It would be nice if people really thought that way. Unfortunately, they don't. I mean, they think of it in kind of much more fragmented or disintegrated ways. So, for example, I assume that New York City has exactly this issue relative to certain entities being built in boroughs, server farms, distribution centers, and that this pattern is not identical to other historical things, which, it changes eventually and stuff goes out of business and things get reorganized and et cetera, et cetera. So it is disintegrated in that sense. And another factor that shatters the illusion of homogeneous space created by the internet is the paradox inherent in the nature of information itself. It makes no sense to compete for ubiquitous information available to everyone. For example, websites and search engines on the internet are very useful for widely disseminating and obtaining universal information, but they are not suitable for delicate negotiations or a competitive collection of confidential information. Not suitable for delicate negotiations or a competitive collection of confidential information. Well, this is an encryption issue, isn't it? Anyway, what is important for competition is personalized and restricted information that can be monopolized by only a few members of the group. A market economy generally cannot offer this sort of information through an impersonal relationship mediated by money, but it takes a special personal relationship to obtain it, and with respect. And it's different because it's a war issue, but cracking the Enigma code and etc. Has that kind of set of relations. Noting that the Enigma machine, as a coding system for the military, has its source in commercial information, I suppose, transmitted with encryption over ultimately telegraph cables. And I don't think there's a lot of literature on it, but I think it's really, it would probably be an interesting literature to look at the relationship of cable stuff, because that was an old question that I had, is why, or is it a international thing? And this is worth looking at, and I didn't spend enough time looking at it. Why didn't, and it's a hypothetical, but I think I'll ask the AI this question, under what conditions were telegraph cables, like undersea cables, submarine cables, sacrosanct during the war? And it comes because I was looking at a map of submarine cable telegraph networks during World War II, and I was noting that, well, in certain areas you could really do a number on a country by blowing up all of its submarine cables. I suppose that would have happened. Well, let's put an example. One example of that probably would be invading Japan, because you could probably cut off, in World War II, that is, you could probably cut off all their cables, and that would be one thing, one element among a larger, thing. And would that reduce the number of casualties? Probably not. It's still an atom bomb deal. But anyway, this type of personalized information also includes the assurances of quality, delivery dates, and business integrity essential to support the market itself, Amazon. Moreover, information that can only be transmitted through personal relationships includes information about new technologies and new markets, which positively contributes to the competitive advantage of individual market players. This creates incentives for them to make locational decisions with a view of increasing their competitive advantage by physically annihilating the space for face-to-face contact and skillfully collecting information that exists only in the agglomerated points. This is the future profit area relative to certain parties trying to seize all your personal information, or privatize it, or monetize it, or whatever, commodify it. So anyway, thus, while the information space aims to create a ubiquitous, absolute space mediated by the internet, the limit of physical bandwidth is producing the individualization and unevenness of space through the production, the individualization and unevenness of space through the production of spatial agglomeration. So an agglomeration is a way of talking about this kind of intersection of, or the tension between relative action spaces and, universalized or, more ubiquitous kinds of things. So anyway, conclusion 4.5. I finally got there, right? Pristine relative space has the properties of determining a position and distance between the positions. Society uses these properties to identify the spatial location of actions. They are also amenable to the class society to differentiate between those in power and various subservient classes. However, the property of distance has a negative effect. Property of distance has a negative effect to society in that it fragments its members. Distance, negative effect, fragmenting members. Therefore, relative space has to be negated. Now, this is the real subsumption of relative space, which can be expressed in the well-known term annihilation of space put forward by Marx in the Grundrisse. The annihilation of space is normally carried out either virtually by time, that is, spatial integration through the means of transport and communication, or directly, as in agglomeration. Agglomeration is triggered by the drive of the capitalists to reduce turnover time. Furthermore, localization economy, a version of agglomeration, brings about the vertical disintegration of labor processes at a locality and concomitant reduction of cost price. There's a lot there. Localization economy, which is a version of agglomeration, brings about the vertical disintegration of labor processes at a locality and concomitant reduction of cost price. The limit of agglomeration is set through the increasing cost to cover wider action space for realization of the commodity produced there. On the other hand, spatial integration has inherent geometrical dialectics. Spatial integration has inherent geometrical dialectics. Since the means of transport and communication are one-dimensional lines, whereas the space to be annihilated is two-dimensional space. Now, to transcend this paradox, a network has to be constructed. Network consists of nodes, which often grow into a center of agglomeration, and the transport lines which connect them. It thereby creates spatial unevenness, since its line segments cannot be made infinitely dense. You know, you measure that in some ways. If you had, well, this is the difference between the concrete fiber optic network and actual, twisted pairs. But anyway, introduction of means of transportation traveling at higher speed, which is more expensive per kilometer, makes the network even sparser. Therefore, as I began this whole chapter with the diagram, in the neoliberal era, the network comes to take the hub and spoke configuration to provide maximum efficiency from the capitalist perspective. So this is conditioned by certain optimization ideas, not that they do it under neoliberalism. And you could see how that drove policy in certain periods. For example, you could say the 92 to 98 U.S. Clinton administration, and its drive to neoliberalize the spectrum or communications industries is a part of that. Now, the problem, of course, is that it created other deregulatory kind of efforts and was problematized, paradoxical, and other authors have pointed that out. And I noted at the beginning the flow chart, right? So we could distinguish the flow chart in that context. So here's the flow chart. And pristine relative space, distance and position, the function of isolation. That's kind of utopian in that sense, and kind of why people move to the country, perhaps. Positive functions, negative functions is, you have to figure out where economic and social subjects interact, and the isolation of goods and subjects from each other. Distance unintentionally separates the members of the social group, so social division occurs. It's a negative function. It denies the market at one level, I suppose, and the group itself due to difficulties to integrate the market and the group. You could even argue, and it is interesting to see that Amazon has tried to do this, and whether it does it successfully or not, I mean, it could spend more time doing it, and in fact, it would become much more interesting, but it doesn't do that, probably because it doesn't want to subsidize it, but in fact it could. And that is community formation in the Amazon network. Or if you were doing consulting for a competitor to Amazon, and the problem of Amazon is that it's a monopoly or a oligopolistic or whatever, it has monopolistic components. You could argue in a consulting way, well, is there a way in which you could maximize certain of these or minimize negative functions and maximize, interaction and thereby improve consumption for your particular firm? Let's put it that way. And I would say that there's some sub-entities that try to do this or that could do this, some of which is useful, others of which are just simply confusing or mystifying. The operation of auction networks like eBay, et cetera, and the attempts that go all the way back to click collection and stuff. This is ways of developing markets when is the market really there? Or at least the mystification of the marketing or the merchandising that does that. Anyway, so the need to annihilate space, and as it is, which is, a very positive thing. There's means of separation, means of identification. The need to annihilate space comes under a negative function. That is the idea of spatial agglomeration, building transport and communication networks, spatial integration, becoming, or the idea that you establish a action space that secures the integrity of the economy and social grouping. And the conclusion of our author is under real subsumption, there is unevenness due to differences in distances from agglomeration points and transportation routes. So on the one hand, from an empirical point of view, you have a description of situations, but as I've tried to point out in various digressions, that real subsumption is, problematized and certainly driven by images of or ideas about formal subsumption. So you have the real and the formal, or the functional and the action, function and action, structure and agency. You have this kind of sets of dichotomies. So anyway, and so a flow chart exhibits the process of subsumption of relative space. It starts with pristine relative space, which has a function of isolation. This space is then separated into positive and negative functions. The positive functions are identified as identifying where economic and social subjects interact, coordination problem, and with path dependency, and isolating goods and subjects from each other. The negative functions are identified as distance unintentionally separates the members of a social group. And in fact, and this is problematic relative to measuring it. How is it that you measure these separations? And in fact, are the separations indicative of the subsumption? But anyway, this leads to a denial of the market and the group itself due to difficulties in integrating the market and the group. So the subsumption of relative space in a diagram. The process of the real subsumption of relative space thus creates a more uneven produced space and spatial discrimination. And, the history is filled with those things. And so we got to the end. And some interesting examples in the references: Marx, David Harvey, Mizuoka's own work, Robert Sack, Alan Scott, and Alfred Weber. So all those are interesting. I added on, which I've added in a couple of these other instances in the material provided in Medium, on problems that are kind of related to this. And often it's just a retranslation or recoding. But, you want to think about what counts as a surplus, a social surplus, and a surplus value, and how are these things relatable. And you can see here that this is an attempt to do a certain set of heterodox revisions that are built on Strophian models. So that's kind of interesting. And I wanted to show, I think this is still Carter's work, the schematic diagram of conventional departmental model. That is Department 2, remember Department 1, Department 2, Volume 2 of Capital. Department 1, Department 2, the circuit of production and the circuit of distribution or consumption, that's collapsed together. So you have input side on the left here, the income accounts, And the output side, which is an output account, and it is um, command relations and bestow relations, which is interesting. And you can see the divisions between the relations of Department 1 and 2 effects. And of course, there's a boundary in here. And yes, there's arithmetic, but, the arithmetic only gets you so far. And I would assert and that it is problematic, too. I mean, it would be interesting to be able to have an interactive diagram, and this probably need math software to do it, is to see how all of this is connected together. It would be fascinating. Could be done not so hard, and which would provide the graphic vision of this, because I think, with all due respect to Steve Keen, et cetera, is that not enough of what are structural dynamics, system dynamic stuff. Well, if it is a system dynamic, then why can't we, rectify some of its ideographic elements and give it not only a pedagogical possibility, that is, Steve Keen mentions how he wants to redo the economics curriculum, and in fact, I wish that he would. But I don't assume that he doesn't have control over a curriculum. Neither do I. But it would be useful to see all these things sort of integrated in a better way. And, those of us who are crazy enough to still think about this, if I were designing a curriculum for a small college, for example, the foundational curriculum would have, integrated GIS, information, systems analysis, system dynamics at the junior and senior level, and et cetera. And you wouldn't need to have an economics major per se, but you could have people designate, because of X number of courses taken, that's an economics major. And yes, it sounds all hippy dippy, and it's kind of like the Santa Cruz curriculum, or some other experimental colleges, but I think you could actually do that. But anyway, that's my little side note on that. And in terms of in this graph, we have the developments of terminology related to money capital and commercial capital. And this is the distinguishing at a lower level, or at a more variegated level, questions of what capital is. That is, there's a commodity capital, there's money capital, they are symptomatic or results of or effects of industrial capital. But then you want to think about, well, there's other elements going on here, right? Finance capital does have a relationship to this. And you want to think about what those things are, because it actually has to do with coordination, path dependency, planning, poly, whatever, organization. And anyway, so I put that kind of thing. And I put a little thing at the end here only because I'm fiddling around with reading, but quantum paradoxes are an interesting idea. And if you're gonna talk about gravity models, you might as well talk about gravity, itself. And I think it confounds or problematizes terrestrial analysis. World systems theory, it doesn't have enough systems in it. It needs more systems. And I think that's kind of where we want to extend Wallerstein or Wallerstein. Anyway, so at some moment, we will extend our little analysis to include other things. And yes, I included, as usual, Rick and Morty, because it's not so much the Rick and Morty fetish, but it is certain ideas, that adhering or cohering to a revolutionary change is actually described within the context of Rick and Morty. That is, at the front end, in the terms of the overall arc of the Rick and Morty narrative over 8 or 9 seasons, you have it in kind of the early period, this idea of a totalized, agglomerated Rick space, right? The citadel of Ricks. And in a subsequent episode, not too far along, I can't remember which season it is, but this particular episode of the Rick Shank Redemption is probably one of my more favorite examples because it does exactly this question that you want to ask from a revolutionary point of view. And that is the simultaneity or the intersection or the collision of, certain kinds of organized discourse or activity, Council of Ricks, being appearing in the prison system of the Galactic Federation. And not it's not the important element, although it is a vanguard kind of action and activity. But we see in this episode where Rick brings down at least the Earth component or branch of the Galactic Federation. The entire global economy is brought down mathematically by Rick, where he changes a 1 to a 0, and hence causes chaos. And so this is, amusing and interesting, and it has other elements to it. But it is this idea of chaos, and chaos would drive out the aliens, and would that we could drive out the fascists in that way. But anyway, needless to say, these expanded elements, and if we were thinking about Minsky in this particular way, we could begin to think about the categorization or the taxonomy or the typology of finance in that context. And we have, all the functional elements, but we also see that this is a static configuration. But what he's trying to do is to array certain Minsky-like categories, and kind of this is important for us in terms of trying to figure out the interrelationships. And as I was trying to do, and I just don't have time or effort or an army of graduate students, is to work out the kind of how is it that we can, as it were, spatialize Minsky. We could argue that certain Minsky-like elements on velocity, et cetera, the money system, finance, capital, et cetera, how does this array itself in a spatial way? Because it has to exist in space, right? I mean, it could exist in your mind, and in fact, in some capitalist minds, that's where it only exists, manifesting itself, of course, in your extra Lamborghini or whatever. But there's other ideas at work here that make it, I think, a viable thing for organizing political change. But anyway, that's the end of my little yammering here, and no one's listening to me online, as far as I can tell. And so let me stop the